Welcome to the 19th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I'll walk you through how to publish, update, and delete data sources maintained on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance using Tableau Server Client. To publish a data source on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, you will need to create the data source object or item. To create a data source object, the name and project ID for which you would like to publish the data source to is required. Additionally, when publishing, you must specify the location in the form of a file path for which the data source you are attempting to publish currently resides. And to delete a data source, simply provide the locally unique identifier value associated with the data source. In most instances, you will not have memorized the data source's locally unique identifier value, so I recommend first fetching the data source object to get the necessary value. To showcase each type of request, let us jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin developing a script that publishes a data source to my Tableau Cloud instance, updates that same data source's owner, and finally deletes that data source. All right, to get started, our first step we're going to take is we're going to configure our authentication objects and our server objects. Our authentication object is going to be composed of 3 parameters, so the token name, the personal elastic token, and the site ID. The server is simply my server address without the site ID appended to it. We're going to use this to authenticate and to sign into my Tableau Cloud instance. So let's go ahead and run that, verify it's running correctly, and it is. The next step is we're going to publish a data source that resides on my local machine, so on this Windows machine, to my Tableau Cloud instance. How we're going to do that? We're going to use the server object that we created and the authentication object to sign in and authenticate to my server. We're going to use that server object and call the use highest version method that's going to allow us to use the most recent Tableau REST API version available and supported by my Tableau Cloud instances version. Next step we're going to do is we're going to specify where we want to figure out where we want to publish this data source to. Let's go ahead and jump over to my Tableau Cloud instance to showcase that. All right, so in my Tableau Cloud instance, I have 5 parent projects. The destination for this data source, and just to let you know, this data source's name is going to be Europe Sales. It's going to live in this Europe Sales parent project, but within there's going to be child projects, and this child project is called data sources. So I want the data source to live here, right? I want my data sources associated with Europe Sales to be in here. Now, I'm showing you this because not only we need to determine where we're going to publish it, right? Because we have to specify that, but also because there's going to be this ambiguity that you have to overcome with this type of structure that I've set up here, at least the folder structure I've set up here. And folder and project, just so you know, those are synonymous terms. So Tableau Server calls them projects. We typically call them folders on our file system. So the ambiguity I'm talking about here is we saw there was a data sources folder within the Europe Sales folder. There's also a data sources folder within the North America Sales folder. So we have to overcome this, right? Because I can't just simply, say publish it to the data sources folder, because there are 2 of them. I need to actually figure out a way to programmatically identify the data sources folder in the right parent project, right? So I want this data sources folder. So let's go ahead and do that, because that's something we will definitely need in order to publish this data source. And this is going to be the hardest part of the publish data source section of this tutorial. The rest of it will be pretty breezy. Let's do that now. Okay, so to do that, what we need to do is we need to first identify that parent project. So we say parent project is equal to server.projects. And I'm going to retrieve that project, that parent project, by saying filter to, where the name is equal to Europe Sales. So this is going to allow me to retrieve that parent project object that has a name of Europe Sales. Next step is projects. So I'm going to say, give me the projects with a name of data sources. So I'm going to use the projects endpoint as well to do that. So I'm going to say filter where the name is equal to data sources. So based on what you just saw, you would expect this query here to return 2 data source objects. You would expect this one to return 1. And the idea is to get the project that lives in the Europe Sales project, right? So it's a child of the Europe Sales project. Okay, so how do we do that? We're going to say project is equal to project for projects and projects if project.parent ID equals parent project .id. So basically what we're saying, in order to determine which data sources folder or project is the one we want, we're checking to see if the parent project attribute maintained for the project. So is the data source's parent ID attribute equal to, so is the parent ID attributes for that data source, is it equal to the ID of the parent project? And if it is, that means that it must be the data source's project that lives in this project, right? So it's a child of that Europe sales project. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And then let's just look at that actual project. So let's say project. And I'll need to actually print this out. So let's print that out. So we have this project. So here's the locally unique identifier. The parent, of course, is this, which is going to be the parent project for Europe. So the ID of Europe sales. And in order to actually see useful information on this, we're going to say __dict. And we'll see here that the name of the folder or the project is data sources. The parent ID is this. And this is how we are determining whether or not we have the right data sources folder, right? Because we don't want the data sources folder or project that lives in North America sales. So just to confirm that, right? So let's just look at this. So let's just go for project and projects. For product and projects, let's do print project _dict. And there's two projects, right? So both called data sources, but only one of them has a parent ID attribute value of this. And this is the one that we want, right? Because that's going to be the actual ID of Europe sales. So I know I'm going pretty deep into this, just trying to make sure that everyone is on the same page as why we are doing this. And this is to overcome the ambiguity of the child project name, data sources, because we want to make sure we publish to the right place. Okay, so we have that. We know where we're going to publish to. Now, in order to publish this data source, we need to create a data source item in terms of Tableau Server Client. So I'm going to say create, let's just say configure the new data source. To do that, we're going to say new data source is equal to tsc.data source item. And to create a new data source, we simply need to provide the name and the product ID for which we're going to publish to. And that's why we did, we jumped through these hoops here, right, to get that ID value. So I'm going to say name is equal to Europe sales, and project ID is equal to project .id. All right, so we have our new data source item. This is what we're actively going to publish this to our Tableau server, or in this case, a Tableau Cloud instance. Before we do that, let's go ahead and build this out. So I'm going to say publish the new data source to the Tableau Cloud instance. And when I do this, I commonly use try, except, else blocks here, just because I want to attempt to publish. And if there's an exception raised, I want to specify, give some type of feedback loop to the user or myself saying, hey, I was unable to publish this data source. And then perhaps maybe a reason why, if you want to go that far. But at the bare minimum, I say I was unable to publish this data source as opposed to just airing out. Otherwise, I'm going to say this data source was successfully published. So let's go ahead and do that now. So try. And what are we going to try? We're going to try to publish a data source. So I'm going to use the data sources endpoint. So I'm going to say server.datasources.publish, the publish method. And what am I going to publish? So I'm going to publish a data source. And that data source item. So the first argument is going to be data source item, and that's going to be equal to new data source, the one that we just configured. And then I have to specify where this data source lives currently on my local machine. So I'm going to say file path. And I'm going to use path. So I'm going to create a path object. So if you notice at the top here, I am actually importing path from pathlib. That's the reason we have this here, to easily configure a path object. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this file path from my machine for which that data source lives. So I have the file path. And the next thing we need to do is we're going to specify what is our publishing method, our publishing type. In this case, we're going to create a new data source. There's also options to append to a pre-existing data source. We're not going to do that here, but appending is pretty simple and straightforward too. You just need to make sure that you're appending data to a pre-existing data source that has the same schema. So same columns, same data types, very similar to a union operation, right? Because you're doing the same thing, more or less. But here we're going to use mode is equal to create new. This is going to create an entirely new data source called Europe Sales. And that's really all we need. There are two optional arguments or keywords here that you can use: connection details if you want to actually pass in the connection details for the data source connection. And you can also configure this to run as a job. Maybe you want to do this asynchronously or something like that. I won't go further into that, but very basic publishing is going to be using the data sources endpoint, using the publish method. You're going to pass in the data source that you've configured. In this case, data source called Europe Sales, and it's going to be published to this project. So this one here, which is basically going to be the data sources folder within the Europe Sales parent project. And we're going to say create new. All right, so if this works, so let's go ahead and try that. If that works, or sorry, if it does not work, we're going to say to the user, or in this case to us, unable to publish new data source name. And what this would print out basically is it's going to say unable to publish Europe Sales. And we're going to say else. So if we succeed, if this goes through successfully, we're going to say print, and we'll say new data source name successfully published. Okay, so let's go ahead and give this a try. So we have an attribute error. What have I misspelled here? Publish, Tableau Server, no attribute, data source item. So that means I have spelled something here wrong, or I have, oh, this is me and my camel casing here. So let's go ahead and fix that real quick. All right, so we've successfully published the data source. So Europe Sales has been successfully published. Let's go ahead and double check that work on our Tableau Cloud instance. So I'm going to switch over to that. So we're within the Europe Sales parent project, and we have a folder called data sources. So when I click into here, we're expecting a Tableau data source to be published to this location. And it is. So you'll notice that I just published this November 5th, 4:22 p.m. So that's going to be CST. Our code worked, right? We were able to successfully programmatically publish a data source residing on our local machine to this Tableau Cloud instance. Great. Okay, so the next step here, I'm going to jump back over to Visual Studio Code. The next step is we want to update. So in this scenario, we want to be able to update a data source's properties. In this case, I want to actually update the ownership. So for example, let's just say I currently own this data source. So I published it, right? I published it to my cloud instance, and I want to programmatically change the owner of the data source as opposed to going to the front end, doing the clicks, clicking OK, and doing it manually. This is going to come in handy, especially if you have to do bulk ownership changes. This type of thing is extremely handy when you have, say, let's say a mapping file that says, hey, I need to change all of the objects for this user to this user, right? That could be data sources, flows, workbooks, etc. Super useful to be able to change the ownership programmatically as opposed to doing it manually. All right, so let's jump into this. How are we going to achieve this? The first thing we're going to do is, well, in order to update a data source, we have to know which one it is. And in order to know which one it is, at least programmatically, we have to fetch that data source, right? So I have to say, hey, I want to update this data source on my Tableau Cloud instance. To do that, we need to create a data source filter for the update request. And what do we want to update? So I want to update this Europe Sales data source that we just created, right? So I'm going to say data source is equal to server.datasources. So same data sources endpoint. We're going to use the filtering method, and I'm going to say name is equal to Europe Sales. And then let's do create a user request, say user filter for the new data source owner. So this is something I am doing because you'll also most likely want to do this just to verify that, hey, I'm trying to assign this to an existing user, right? So I'm taking a data source that's owned by Chris and transferring it to an existing user named John. So I'm going to verify that not only does the data source exist that I'm trying to filter. So you can, of course, query the data sources endpoint, your server all day long, or your cloud instance all day long for a data source called Europe sales. But if it doesn't return anything, if it returns an empty query set, you're not going to be able to update something that doesn't exist. Same thing applies to transferring ownership to a non-existing user, right? That's not going to work out. So we're going to double check that both of those things exist. So not only does the data source by the name that you provided exist, but also the user for which you're trying to transfer the data source to. So I'm going to say user is equal to server.users.filter. Name is equal to solo. So I have two users on my server or cloud instance at this time, and they're both my email addresses. So this is another email address I have, mostly related to my gaming activities, sql@gmail.com. And this should be server. So we're using the user's endpoint to retrieve a user object that resides on my server or exists on my server with a name of soloqlegend@sql@gmail.com. All right, if you're unfamiliar with either of these endpoints, just check out my previous tutorials on creating reports using the data sources endpoints, creating reports using the user's endpoint. It's gonna be very straightforward. You'll learn the ins and outs of each of these endpoints, the attributes for each user object and data source object maintained on your server or cloud instance. This will all be very straightforward for you. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna retrieve the specific data source object requiring updates if it exists, right? Because we're going to check for its existence before we do something. I'm going to say if data source and user. So these return a query set. If the query set is empty, so the list is empty within this query set, we're going to basically tell the user, hey, the data source and or user are not found. If they're both populated, so if we successfully fetched a data source named Europe sales and we successfully fetched a data source, a user named with this name, then let's go ahead and perform that action, right? Let's transfer the ownership of the data source to the new user. Okay, we're gonna do that in a Pythonic manner, right? We're gonna check that the list is not empty. Both of these, the query sets are not empty. I'm gonna say data source. So if they're not empty, I'm gonna say equals the first data source item in that query set. User equals user, again, first item in that query set. And then we're going to say update. So this can actually go in the same indents. Update the data source's owner. And this is where we're going to do another try except block. So we're going to do try except else. If we were able to successfully update the data source or transfer the ownership of, from one user to another, then great. Otherwise, tell the user that we were unsuccessful in this task. All right, so to update the data source's owner, we need to access the owner ID attribute of the data source object. So every data source object has an owner ID attribute. It's populated with a locally unique identifier, which is tied to a user ID. So to do that, I'm going to say data source.ownerID is equal to user.id. So I'm simply saying, take this data source object that we've retrieved called Europe sales, update the owner ID attribute for that object, set it equal to the ID for the user that we're trying to transfer the ownership to. All right, so let's try to do that. We're going to say server.datasources, and I need to remember it's no underscore, dot update, and we're going to pass in that data source. If there is an issue, we're going to tell that to the user, or in this case, ourselves. Unable to update the owner for the data source. Let's just say for data source .name and close that out. If we're successful in transferring this ownership from, say, one user to another, we're going to state that. So I'm going to say same idea here, print successfully updated the owner for the data source. And round this out with an else and say that, hey, we weren't able to find the user or data source. Okay, so just recap what we're doing here. We're creating a data source filter to retrieve the data source that is called Europe sales, right? Because we just published this, right? It exists on our server. We're creating a user filter to retrieve the user object that has a name of this, because this is who we're going to transfer it to, right? I want to transfer from one user to this user. We're going to check the existence of that data source and user on my Tableau Cloud instance. So if this query set is not empty for both of those, then we're going to go ahead and say, okay, the data source is equal to the value found in that query set. The user is equal to the value found in that query set. We're going to go ahead and attempt to update the owner ID attributes for that data source. And that attempt is going to be right here. If we're successful, we're going to say, okay, well, great. We successfully updated the owner for that data source. Otherwise, we were unable to update it. And if we can't find either of these, right, if the data source or user don't exist, then we're going to specify the data source and or user not found. Let's go ahead and do this now. And before I do this, I just want to go back. Let's just go back to my Tableau Cloud instance and to that data source. So let's click on this and see who the owner is. So the owner is Chris Perry. So this is probably going to be the same exact name, but what you're going to have to do is we're going to click into here, right, to see the email address associated with that owner. And it's this, right? So I'm showing you this so that you can see that, hey, this actually worked, right? So let's go back here, and then I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and execute this. So let's run this. All right, so we successfully updated the owner for the Europe sales data source. And let's jump back to Visual Studio Code. Let's just refresh this. Sorry, not Visual Studio Code, my Tableau Cloud instance. And I'm going to click on this owner again. So we're in the same data source. I'm going to click on the owner. You'll notice the ownership changed. So it changed to a different user, of course, the same name because both of these accounts are tied to me. But we successfully updated the ownership. We transferred the ownership of one object to another user, right? Awesome. So let's jump back into Visual Studio Code for the last step in this tutorial. And that last step is simply going to be to delete the data source. So we publish the data source, then we change the ownership of the data source, and now we're finally going to delete it. You're not going to do this in a real world scenario, right? At least not sequentially like that, but I'm just trying to showcase some of the key things you can do with the API that are going to allow you to enhance your productivity, right? So you're going to be able to do these types of things in bulk. Let's just say, hey, I need to delete a bunch of content from our server in bulk, or I want to do it based on some conditions, right? Well, you do that programmatically using Python and Tableau Server Client, like we've been showing here. All right, to delete the data source from my Tableau Cloud instance, what I need to do, just like when we were updating, I need to actually fetch in that data source. So I need to say, give me the data source called Europe sales that exists on my Tableau Cloud instance. And to do that, let's just go ahead and write this out. Create a data source filter for the deletion request. We're going to say data source is equal to server.data sources. So same idea, right, as above. So I'm just going to retype it for the purpose of this video. So name is equal to Europe sales. And then we're going to check for its existence, right? Because we're not going to attempt to delete something that does not exist. So let's go ahead and try that. And we're going to use the same strategy that we used in the previous, or at least in the previous request to update the ownership, right? So I'm going to say, if the query set for the data source is empty, then tell the user the data source cannot be found, right? There's nothing that's been returned by the query. If it is not empty, so that means we have a data source called Europe sales, then I'm going to try to delete that data source from the server by providing the ID attributes of that data source. Let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to say retrieve the specific data source object requiring deletion. Let's just caveat that if it exists, right? Because that's the whole point of this block of code that I'm about to type. So if data source, we're going to say data source equals data source. So it's going to be the first value in that query set returned. I'm going to say delete the data source from the Tableau Cloud instance. We're going to do that try except else block pattern that we've done throughout this tutorial. So I'm going to say try server.data sources using the data sources endpoint, the delete method, and I'm going to say data source ID is equal to data source .id. So you'll notice this is a little bit different, right? Because whenever we were updating a data source, we needed to provide the actual entire object, right? In this case, to delete a data source, for the delete method, we simply need to provide the ID value of that object. So just keep in mind that whenever you're attempting to do this, right? You might see an error if you just simply provide the entire data source object as opposed to just the attributes associated with the ID of it. So if we can't do this successfully, let's go ahead and say we can't. Unable to delete data source.name. So that's going to say unable to delete Europe sales. If we are successful, we're going to say as such. So I'm missing a quote here. Else prints successfully updated. Sorry, successfully deleted, not updated. All right. And of course, if that query set is empty, aka the data source does not exist by the name of Europe sales, we're going to tell that to the user. So we're going to say else prints data source not found. Okay, now we simply need to run this to delete the data source. Let's go ahead and do that. And we successfully deleted the Europe sales data source. So to verify that, let's jump back over to my Tableau Cloud instance. And you'll notice that I am in the parent project Europe sales. And now I'm going to click into the data sources project that lives within this full project. So let's go ahead and click here. And what we should be expecting here is we should be expecting that our Europe sales data source no longer exists. So remember, this Europe sales data source we previously published at the beginning of this tutorial using Tableau Server Client. And there you have it. Or you don't have it, right? The data source has actually been deleted. So we're successfully deleted this data source. And that wraps up this tutorial. But before I do close, I want to showcase where you can find these scripts that I've been writing in these tutorials. So I've done about 20 tutorials so far. Well, almost there. This is the 19th one. Those tutorials and the scripts, so I call them, and I'm putting air quotes, nearly ready to go scripts. They require minor adjustments. But for this one, for example, or for the previous ones, like if we go to, so my last tutorial was on projects, I believe. If we go to projects, you're going to see a Python file that is associated with each of the things that I showcased in that tutorial. So creating projects, deleting projects, updating projects. So to create a project, here's the code, right? So I give you the code to connect to your server. So create the authentication object, the server object. I give you basically what I've done here but with data sources. Then you just have to make some minor edits, right? So in this case, you're going to update your server address. You're going to update, obviously, the way you store and retrieve your token value. Your site ID is going to be different, right? It's not going to be SQL short reads, but it gives you a template for doing the same thing and then bolting on, the extra stuff you want to do, right? So these are just beginner tutorials. In the real world, I've used these same concepts to do some crazy things. So like save hundreds of hours and thousands of clicks by using Tableau Server Client and Python together to automate a lot of Tableau server management type of tasks. So I just want to let you know it's all out there. So I have, in this latest portion of the series, I've been talking about adding, updating, and removing objects. So far I've talked about groups, projects, users. I've showcased how you can automatically or programmatically refresh your extracts, programmatically trigger flows, link tasks, and what I was speaking about earlier about the endpoints, right? The easiest way to get familiar with endpoints, at least for Tableau Server Clients or your REST API, is going to be work with them, right? So go through these tutorials on generating data, like reports for data sources, favorites, flows. These are all the major types of objects that you maintain on your Tableau server or cloud instance. It's pretty straightforward, but it's for reporting purposes, but it uses most of the attributes that are maintained for each object type. So you'll very quickly learn, okay, what is that attribute called? What does it store? But yeah, so here, just check it out. It's on my GitHub. My GitHub is coding on Windows OS. There's also going to be a link in the comment section and in the description of this video, so it'll also be there. Yeah, so I hope you find that useful, and that's going to wrap up this video on modifying data sources programmatically through Tableau Server Client. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance through automation. Thank you. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.